So let's work on our ingredients list. The base form is working, but of course we got another control which we haven't added yet. This is this array of ingredients. So when we initialize the form, we actually will have one other default value for the recipe ingredients. This will be a new form array. And you should import form array from @AngularForms. This form array is initialized with a default value of an empty array because we don't have any ingredients by default. Now with this, if that is our default, what do we overwrite it to here in edit mode? Well, there we will simply need to check if we have any ingredients to begin with, because theoretically you could create a recipe without ingredients. So here what I want to do is I want to check if my recipe which I loaded, if it does have ingredients. So if that is defined, I know I can safely use them. So in this case, I want to use all the ingredients, so I can simply loop through them with a for of loop. So for a single ingredient of my ingredients, I can go through all of them and I can push them onto my recipe ingredients form array, which has a push method. Here, I don't push the ingredient, I push a new form group instead, because I do have two controls which will control a single ingredient, the name and the amount. So these will be grouped in a form group, and here I will have a name, which is now a new form control, with a default value of ingredient name, and I will have an amount control, also a new form control, which has the default value ingredient amount. Whoops, not name, amount. So that is a form group I will push onto this array, because again we have two controls here. Validation will follow later. And with that we got a default value for recipe ingredients if we have a recipe and if this recipe then has ingredients. With that we can assign the ingredients control down there, and it simply is our recipe ingredients, which already is this new form array here. So that's looking all right. Let's see if it works, and for that of course we need to synchronize our array with our HTML code. So in the recipe edit component, if we scroll down to that section where we want to use the array, I'll first work on the div which wraps the whole section we're going to use. Here I need to add the form array name directive. This will then be bound to ingredients, because ingredients, keep in mind, is the name of our form array here. So that assigns that in this area we're going to handle this array of controls. Now each control of course is now going to be our row here. So on this row I can place the form group name directive referring to the individual form group name, because remember in our array we will have form groups, as each pair of name and amount control creates a form group. Now what's the name of the form group though? We didn't assign it because it's part of the array. Well, we learned how to get this name. We need to add ng4 to this div, and then we can loop through all the ingredients, through all the controls I should say, in our array. So I can loop through the ingredient control of my recipe form, and there get the ingredients control. Get is a method which gives us access to that, and here all the controls of this control. So this gives us access to all the controls, and the individual control is now saved in the ingredient control property or variable we can use in a template. And I can also extract the index of the current iteration, which will be the name for my form group. So with property binding, I can now bind I here. This should give me the form group. Now we also need to populate these inputs, and there it's very easy because now we're inside the form group And there we have names, we have name and amount. So here we can again use form control name, set this equal to name for the first control, and form control name equal to amount for the second one. Let's see if that works as expected. Well, it already looks pretty good to me here. We got buns and meat. And if we added the schnitzel, we get meat and French fries. So that gets populated correctly. This is working as intended. With that, we got our array added. Now, of course, we also need to add a way for us to dynamically add new items to that. In the last lecture, we added our array. Now I want to clean up how it looks, some styling, but mainly I want to add a button which allows us to add a new ingredient to that array. Well, to work on the styling, all I really want to do is I want to have some spacing between the rows. Well, there are a couple of ways of getting this style. What I will simply do is I will add an inline style, a normal style, no angular style, no ng style directive. A normal style where I say margin, top, and set this to 10 pixels maybe. And with that, it looks much better. So that's all I wanted to do for now. The more important part is that we're able to add new ingredients. And for this, I'll simply add a new button at the end of this array area. So outside of the div which is responsible for my individual form groups, I'll add a new row with a new column inside of it. And here I will simply add a button which says add ingredient, which will be of type, or which will get a class of button success maybe. So now it sits directly at the bottom. Maybe let's simply add a horizontal line between rows, and that looks pretty good. So now we get this button. Let's now also hook it up. I will add a click listener on add ingredient, and here in this method, which I'll add to the TypeScript file, I want to add a new control to this array of form controls. Now I can simply do this by accessing my recipe form. There I can get my ingredients control, and I know that this will be a form array, but Angular, or TypeScript to be precise, doesn't know this. So I will explicitly cast it with this cast command here, basically by enclosing the type I want to convert it to between smaller than and greater than signs, and then enclosing this all in parentheses. And now the part here between the parentheses is treated like a form array because I know that it indeed is one. So here I can call push, and I want to push a new form group, because remember, we don't push a control here, we need two inputs, so a group of inputs. And there again, I will have a name, which is a new form control, and I will have an amount, which will be a new form control. And we don't need to provide any initial values because I don't want to have any. So if I save this and we go back to the application, we should indeed see that once this reloads here, if I click add ingredient, we add a new line. However, I also submit the form with each click, as you can see here on the right. This is quickly fixed by making sure that this button receives the type button, and now it shouldn't submit the form anymore. So now it just adds ingredients. This is all working. This is great. Now, before we make this form submittable, or we do something up on submission, let's make sure that we add some validation to it. We finished our form in its basic form, but time to add some validation to it. We do add validation, of course, in our TypeScript code. Right now, there is no validation attached to any of the controls, and that is not really the behavior I want. When we initialize the form here at the end of init form, for the name, for example, I want to add a built-in validator. So from the validators package, which we need to import from @AngularForms. So from this package, I want to add the required validator. Don't execute it. don't add parentheses, you only want to pass a reference to this validator, so that Angular is able to execute this method at the time it validates the input. Now, the image path, that should also be required. So I'll repeat the procedure here. Add required, don't execute it. And I'll copy it because I also want to require the description. For the ingredients, when we create a new ingredient here, the name should also be required. And the amount, here I'm going to add 2 checks. The first one is that it's required. The second element here actually is the pattern validator. And here we can copy the pattern we used in the shopping edit component. This regular expression here, it's the same expression I want to validate here, that we only have positive numbers. Here in pattern, you simply pass a regular expression by putting 2 forward slashes and in between your expression without any quotation marks here. So that is the pattern, and we do execute this method because this acts like the factory. It gives us back the configured validator then, which will be used by Angular. But to configure it, we need to pass an argument, right? We need to tell it what should be our pattern. So that are the validators for a new form control in the array, for the new amount control, I should say. Let's also copy that to the onAddIngredient method, where we also create a new form array form group. So here I will set the default values to null and then also add my validators. And the same for the name, should have an empty default value, and then here just the required validator. So now validation should be added to the form successful, and to use it I will disable the save button if the form is not valid. So I will bind to disabled and check if recipe form is not valid. Well, let's see. If this reloads, we should see that the save button gets disabled, I would say, but right, we got a valid form here. So let's empty the name, and it's disabled, that looks good. Let's now empty the description, disabled, the URL, disabled, or any control here, so the name of this ingredient, or maybe the number or a negative number. So that all seems to work. The validation state is successfully taken into account. Now to finish the validation, I'll go to my CSS sheet and I want to mark invalid inputs. Now we get this handy ngInvalid class, which is added to anything which is invalid. And that's the problem. If I add a border of, let's say, 1 pixel, solid and red, well, watch for yourself. If I remove that, not only is the name input field invalid, the whole form is. So the whole form has this ugly border. Well, we can simply change this to assign or assign this class, the style I should say, only to elements which have the ngInvalid class, but which also are an input, or optionally, to be very explicit here, a text area in our case here with ngInvalid. So with this now, we should make sure that if I remove this, only the box itself receives the red border. To prevent this from having the red border right from the start, I'll also add ngTouched here as a check or as a class which has to be present, so that we at least had to click into that control to mark it as invalid. You will see what I mean if I add a new recipe. Everything is clean. If I click in here and out of there, now it has the red border. So that is validation working as it looks to me. Now let's make sure that we can actually submit a form and save it or successfully update it.